The Fisher quantity theory of money says that velocity is fairly constant in the short run. Now the question is velocity a constant? The classical economists' conclusion that nominal income is determined by movements in the money supply rested on their belief that velocity could be treated as reasonably constant. Is it reasonable to assume that velocity is constant? Look at this figure. This is a time series figure. We have a data from 1915 to 2002. M1 represents M1 money supply figure and M2 represents M2 money supply figures. The blue shaded areas represent different courses of recessions. Look at the case of First World War, look at the case of Second World War, look at the case of oil prices, different wars, Great Depression, etc. You will find different fluctuations. It means that velocity is not a constant, which Fisher assumed in his theory. Actually, this figure shows the year-to-year changes in velocity over the period 1915 to 2002. Nominal income is known as nominal GDP. Money supply is represented by M1 and M2. What we see is the figure in that even in the short run, velocity fluctuates too much to be viewed as a constant because Fisher assumed that velocity is constant in the short run. But in the figure, we can see that velocity fluctuates too much. Prior to 1950, velocity exhibited large swings ups and down. Look at the first half part of the figure. Before 1950, velocity fluctuates too much. There are very clear ups and downs in the figure in the money supply. This may reflect the substantial instability of the economy in this period, which included World War I, World War II, and the Great Depression of 1929. Why there are different ups and swings in the first part of this figure? I mean to say that before the year 1950, there are very clear ups and downs in this figure because the economy experiences different recessions in the shape of World War I, World War II, and the Great Depression. So velocity actually falls, or at least its rate of growth declines. If there are recessionary periods, the value of velocity will fall. However, after 1950, velocity appears to have more moderate fluctuations. Look at the figure again. I mean to say after the year 1950. Again, there are changes, but these changes are moderate. But in the first case, before 1950, the changes were huge. So the percentage change in M1 velocity from 1980 to 1982 was 2.5%, whereas from 1980 to 1981, velocity grew at a rate of 4.2%. The difference of 6.7% means that nominal GDP was 6.7% lower than it would have been if velocity had kept growing at the same rate as in 1981 to 1982. After 1982, M1 velocity appears to have become even more volatile, a fact that has puzzled researchers when they examine the empirical evidence on the demand for money. M2 velocity remained more stable than M1 velocity after 1981, with the result that the Federal Reserve dropped its M1 targets in 1987 and began to focus more on M2 targets. So until the Great Depression, economists did not recognize that velocity declined sharply during severe economic contractions. As you saw in the figure, that the value of velocity declines during the courses of recessions. Now the question is, why did the classical economists not recognize this fact when it is easy to see in the pre-depression period in that figure? Because at that time accurate data on GDP and the money supply was not available. before the World War II. And after the World War II, the government started to collect data on GDP and money supply. That's why, for the empirical evidence, they don't have data at that time. But after the World War II, the government started to collect data. Economists had no way of knowing that their view of velocity as a constant was false, because at that time they don't have data, so they didn't test the data, and there was no empirical evidence that velocity is not a constant. So this was a theoretical view, and this view failed because velocity is not a constant. The decline in velocity during the Great Depression year was so great that even the crude data available to economists at that time suggested that velocity was not constant. This explains why after the Great Depression economists began to search for other factors influencing the demand for money that might help explain the large fluctuations in velocity. So, with the help of the accurate data, the economists came to know that velocity is not fairly constant in the short run.